part 4. We're going to look at Ben Shah's piece on Sacco and Vanzetti. So Sacco and Vanzetti were labor organizers in the early 20th century, and so the local and federal government were very upset with this labor organizing, and also the fact that they avoided the draft in World War II. So they were agitators, and this was kind of getting in the way of some of the corporations making their money. So they were convicted of robbery and murder, which was trumped up. It was false, and they went ahead with this execution. So Ben Shah, as a political activist, is demonstrating this injustice and showing how the court being back here and the judge here, were behind this, and these two commissioners as well. So the portrait of the judge, he collapses to the time. It's all kind of smushed together. Of course, these people did not attend the funerals and hold flowers. That's absolutely incorrect. But he's trying to show this institutional rigidity and how they ended up in coffins. Another protest piece, we're looking at Jacob Lawrence, who's an African-American gentleman who painted depictions of events in African-American lives and heroism, specifically Harriet Tubman and John Brown in the U.S. And then this is to do with Haiti and the uprising of the slaves there. We kind of forget sometimes how pervasive slavery was in other areas, because the U.S. kind of held on the longest, unfortunately, to slavery. But in the Caribbean, where Haiti is located, there was also slavery, but there were some more revolts going on there. Government was a little bit looser or more sparse, I guess you could say. But Toussaint here is in our chair. This is a really horrible looking little room. It looks like a prison cell. We don't know for sure, but we're sort of imagining that's his intent here. But here's this Toussaint sitting here, and then we have Luke Clerc fighting, in a sword fight. So anyway, once that he was out of the way, the blacks would surrender and go back to slavery. So they try to kill him or attack him. It doesn't happen. But he does die later in prison. But he sets the tone about, for the abolition of slavery there in 1784. And then they become independent in, 1804? Yeah, 1804 becomes the first black-led country in the world, in the Western Hemisphere, if that makes sense. Because we're dealing with, slavery that's coming from Africa, and we have a lot of people in the Western Hemisphere. And so anyway, that's how that happens, and it's a really interesting piece. He uses a lot of flat areas of color, and he uses tempera in this case. All right, so he trained during the Harlem Renaissance. He was influenced by community of artists. Now, this is a later piece, Faith Ringgold's piece here, The Bitter Nest, the Harlem Renaissance Party, with figures that were the dominant artists and writers of that time in the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, switching gears a little bit. So, Hans Hake's Metro Mobileton. So, this is a piece that is about apartheid. And you may not have heard a lot about apartheid because it's ended now, but it really reached a peak of resistance and demonstration in the 80s. When I was in college, it was a big deal. And what it was in Africa, in southern Africa, the Dutch and the English had taken over and colonized it, and then subjugated all the native peoples that lived there for quite a long time. So there was a double standard of, and I think there was like a third standard of like a middle sort of designation for mixed race and for Indian people. There were a lot of people from India. And if you look back into history, Gandhi was there at a certain point in time, and some of this racism inspired Gandhi to act and do what he did. At any rate, Nelson Mandela, you can't forget him. He was imprisoned at this time for being an activist. He was in prison for a very long time. So Mobil was one of the corporations, even though that was behind or had investments in South Africa. And it's very interesting to note, and I know it's a little confusing to you guys, but the U.S. official policy was saying that they were anti-South Africa, anti-apartheid, but because Mobil and other giant corporations had money in South Africa, we are kind of guilty in the sense that our money or our companies are there making a profit. So they are sort of supporting it. So a lot of people in the 80s, more than in the 60s and 70s, what the focus of the protest art and protests in general in the 80s were to do with where is money, if that makes sense, as opposed to who are the politicians or the police and that kind of thing. Okay, so then this was interesting because there was a Treasures of Ancient Nigeria. So this was kind of interesting. So sort of a resistance against Mobil's financial backing. We just recently had a similar situation, and I'm forgetting the name of the company or the family that sells OxyContin opioids, and a British museum declined to take their money because they feel that they were responsible for the opioid crisis in America. And I thought that was very interesting. So there are times where people will not accept money, or they will dig out who really is behind the money. All right, very dark piece here. We have a couple more dark ones to go. Ed Keenholtz, really fantastic, interesting artist, does these wild installations that use real objects, probably from the real institutions even. But he is trying to be shocking and ugly. His work is really typically very icky and sort of scratchy and really unpleasant. So he is criticizing mental health institutions, the state hospitals, and the faces have been removed, and these become fish bowls with like a black fish just swimming around in there. Nudity, of course, but really the point of the starvation and the lack of muscle tone here, just not treating somebody in a humane kind of a way. Oh, this is in Stockholm now. Sorry, I didn't notice that. So the idea of protesting society's treatment of people, and he's really exposing the neglect and filth. And the thing is, when you look at this piece, you're looking through sort of a window, and you're sort of like a prison guard or a mental health person working in that institution looking in the window. So you're sort of complicit, or you're acting as one of the people maintaining this, so you get a feeling for what's happening. So he did have experience in an actual mental hospital, and he saw a staff member repeatedly hit a patient. So that's, I don't know, this really very ugly detail here, but soap in a towel or soap or a book or other hard object, when they put it inside of a cloth and beat somebody with it, it doesn't show up. All right, slightly less graphic and horrifying. Back to our Coca-Cola series. Now, the text here was silk screened on, and I was kind of forgetting that detail when I mentioned that earlier. So she took these recycled bottles and silk screened on her text down here, and you could only kind of see it when the bottle was full. But it was, again, about using anti-U.S. involvement and kind of about consumption. All right, humor is another strategy here for protest, Sun Mad, and this is just such a fantastic piece. The graphics are just amazing. So the raisin growers are using, and this is a print, by the way. A serigraph is a silkscreen, just to point that out. So, and a lot of protest art you can look up self-help graphics in Los Angeles. It was actually run by a Catholic nun back in the 70s, 60s, 70s. She passed away, but I've had friends that worked there. Really interesting place in East LA where a lot of silk screening happened. I don't know that this was made there, but that's the kind of thing that would be happening. So raisin growers are using insecticide. Now raisin growers are grape growers. And if you remember, the Cesar Chavez whole protest was against the grapes because they were using so many contaminating chemicals and people were dying and getting sick. So Esther Hernandez here is protesting the groundwater. And this is not far from you guys, you know. This is the Central Valley and this is what is grown, you know. So there's an idea that they're actually promoting death here. So unnaturally grown with insecticides, miticides, herbicides, fungicides. So all that stuff's quite deadly. And it was a really powerful image here, which I think is really great to use that sort of sense of humor because you want to look at it longer. It's funny and it's recognizable and it's dark at the same time. So she's trying to reach many people. Also, the art form meaning silk screens, so she could pass these out or distribute this image more frequently as opposed to one piece being in a museum. So she wanted to explain how chemical pesticides are used in vineyards. All right, I'm going to stop there.